Cool, so hello everyone. Last session of the day, it was actually pushed, which made me happy because otherwise I would compete with Miguel de Icaza, and that's never an easy task. So apparently the gods listened to me and pushed my session 1 hour. Thank you for sticking with us, like they say. My name is Laurent Bugnion. I am going to talk to you today about building cross-platform applications with Xamarin, Xamarin.Forms, and MVVM Light. And a couple of words about me. I work for a firm called IdentityMine. We are located in Seattle. I'm located in Zurich, Switzerland. And we work on applications across the platforms, specialists in user experience. And so, of course, we are very interested in seeing the whole native application experience being ported to different platforms. I'm also the creator of MVVM Light. I see a lot of people coming in. Sorry, guys, for starting on time. But anyway, we have actually time since it's the last session of the day, so we're going to take it easy. So I guess the first question you might want to ask yourself is, why do you want to use MVVM, the model view model pattern, especially in Xamarin Android and Xamarin iOS? On the XAML side, on the Windows XAML side, it makes sense because this is a well-known pattern. We have been using it for many, many years now. And also, we have data binding natively inside the framework. But on Xamarin Android and Xamarin iOS, this is already an MVC pattern. So does it make sense to add MVVM to that? So if you consider a typical view in mobile applications nowadays, this is how it looks like. You have some kind of XAML, some kind of markup. Sorry, it can be XAML on the Windows side. On Android, we have XAML. On iOS, we have storyboards, Xib, or something else. It's optional. You can build your whole UI in code if you prefer. Personally, I like to use markup, especially if you work with visual designers. It really helps to have this visual design experience. And then you have some kind of code. Sometimes we call it code behind on the Windows side. On iOS, we call them controllers. On Android, we call them activities. But basically, the process here, the role of this code is always the same. It is to handle events from the user side. It is to prepare the view, depending on the model, to react to model changes and actualize the view. And the big disadvantage of that code is that it is mostly untestable. What I mean here is unit tests. You cannot really unit test view code. And also, it is mostly unshareable. Any one of you who did the university courses or any of the Xamarin samples knows that you have to write the controller and you have to write the activity. And you cannot really share code between those two. So if you consider a classic Xamarin application, it looks a little bit like that. You have quite a lot of code which can be shared at the model level, data access, web services, JSON deserialization and serialization, and all these kind of things. But on top of it, you have the 3 silos still. And even though you can share quite a lot of code, we can do better. And what we do now is adding an additional layer called the view model layer on top of that. So what does the view model layer do? Basically, it exposes some properties which are helping the view to be displayed, which are actualizing the view. And it is also exposing some commands which are reacting to user input. Notice the data binding layer in between. This is, of course, also optional. You can do MVVM without using data binding. Data binding help. It's just more comfortable to use that, and we'll see a little bit later more information about data binding. So in bullet points, it is better for maintaining and extending your code because you have some smaller layers, some clearly defined roles, and you have a clear decoupling between those layers. So you can really work quite independently on each of those layers. It is also, of course, better for collaboration because of the fact that your teams are going to be able to work quite independently on each layer, and they are going to be able to collaborate using some clearly defined interfaces. Also, it is better for unit testing because the view model layer that we saw before is unit testable. In most cases, you can write unit tests against that. This is absolutely doable. And so you increase the surface of your application, which can be unit tested. And also, a side effect, which is really nice for people like me who work with visual designers a lot and with the people designers, the designer persons a lot, It is also better for design because of the decoupling and the abstractions. You can easily create some design time data, which is going to help you either in the designer itself, especially on the Windows side. Blend is really loving the MVVM pattern. You can really create some very rich design time data. On the Xamarin side, the designer is a little bit more static, though there are improvements coming. Okay. That said, you can still use a design time service in order to generate design time code and run your application, not against the actual web services and database and all that, but against some design time data, which you can customize for your design needs. So it's quite convenient. When you work with cross-platforms, you have to abstract some things. And especially all the view interactions from the view model needs to be abstracted. In MVVM, we say that the view model shouldn't know the view. It shouldn't know which platform it is running on. So for example, if you consider a dialog, dialogs look very similar on all three platforms. But if you consider the code which creates those dialogues, it couldn't be more different. And so, of course, this is a problem. Because if you have a view model which is interacting with a view, if you have just one view, you could imagine showing a dialog from the view model. We all did messagebox.show from the view model, or whatever the equivalent is in iOS, Android, etc. It's not very good, though, especially if you have multiple views, because multiple view frameworks, right? Then it starts to get very difficult. You have to put some if-defs, and nobody wants that. So instead, what we are going to do is something like that. We are going to build an abstraction of the view service, in that case, a dialog service. And we are going to put it into the view model, inject it, or use any techniques that you prefer. Personally, I like dependency injection with an IOC container. And then the view model is going to interact with this iDialog service in that case. And then you have one implementation per platform. Okay? Same thing for the iNavigation service. It's also a well-known view service which causes issue because navigation on Windows Phone is not the same than on iOS, is not the same than on Android or in Xamarin.Forms for that matter. So now in the new version of MVVM Light, I'm happy to announce that you will have an iDialog service, iNavigation service interface, as well as an implementation for each supported platform, which is a nice improvement. It has been requested often. And so this implementation is a simple implementation. You're free to replace it. As usual in MVVM Light, you can easily replace a component with another implementation if you prefer. We'll talk more about that in a second. When you unit test your view models, it's also an advantage to have this kind of pattern, because if the view model is being unit tested, the unit test cannot assert a value against the actual dialog service. For example, how do you assert that a message box has been displayed to the user? You cannot do that. So instead, we are going to build a mock or a stub of this well-known interface. And this well-known implementation is going to expose some properties which can be tested, which can be asserted. We are going to say, well, yes, the dialog has been displayed to the user with the following parameters. And like this, we can do an assertion. So introducing MVVM Light to those of you who don't know it, it is quite a popular toolkit on the Windows side, on the Microsoft side. Porting it to Android is a task that I was really happy to do. It totally makes sense, in my opinion, to have a simple toolkit helping you to build MVVM applications here. It is composed of a set of libraries. So those are DLLs that you add to your code, either through NuGet or directly as references. Some templates. You can do the file new project experience in Visual Studio, get the file new project, new MVVM Light. For the moment, the templates are only available on the Windows side. I'm going to port them to Android very soon. Snippets, code snippets are a great productivity tool, especially in Visual Studio, where you can just type a shortcut, type tab. We'll see an example of that later, and then it expands some code. So you have a collection of snippets which help you to type code, or rather to avoid typing code, I should say, and especially avoid errors and typos and things which basically consume quite a lot of time. And also some guidance. I write a lot of blog posts on MVVM Light. I also write some MSDN magazine articles. I have a series which was published recently. I also have a Perl side course, a video course, almost 5 hours of content, and we are working, right, Jesse, on new courses. Or at least soon. So that's a nice guidance here. To this day, I have approximately 560,000 downloads, which is pretty much exclusively on the Windows side at the time, and so I'm happy to add Xamarin to the mix. What I mean with that number is not that I'm proud of it, I am quite proud of it, but mostly it's that there is a huge community of users, and so if you go to Stack Overflow and you check the tag MVVM Light, you'll find quite a lot of questions and answers there. And today I'm happy to announce version 5. I just published it about 2 hours ago. On NuGet and as a Visual Studio extension. And so you will be, from after the session, able to download it, install it, start playing, and check the samples that I'm going to show you in a second. So in terms of components, we have an iCommand implementation. iCommand is a very important part of the MVVM pattern. It's a way to expose a command, to expose a functionality on the view model, and to have a loose coupling between the control and the command. We'll talk more about that. There is a messenger. This is an event bus, basically a way to send messages from a source, from a sender and a receiver, without those two objects having to know each other. There is an IOC container. It's a simple IOC container, like the name shows, but it is enough for many tasks, especially on mobile applications. If you need a more powerful IOC container, you can just swap it quite easily in the code and use your own if you prefer. Of course, iNotify property changed is the basis, the foundation stone of MVVM. So we have implementations, observable object, and view model base. A few more things that I added in V5. There is a binding framework and a commanding framework for Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android. That was, I think, a simple binding framework and commanding framework was kind of missing on this space. And so now I decided to create one. We'll talk more about that. I also created an observable adapter and observable controller because I hate to write adapters and controllers. I find that it's a waste of time. So here you have one which is generated automatically, and especially interesting when you are attaching it to an observable collection in C# because the UI will be refreshed automatically when the collection changes, which is, of course, an interesting feature. There are also a few tools, like I said, file new projects or some templates. More templates are coming to the Xamarin side soon. Code snippets, I mentioned that already. There are also some code snippets specifically for Android. We'll see a demo in a moment. So why now, after understanding why MVVM, why data binding? Okay, and again, right, this is optional. You can do MVVM in Android and iOS in your code behind without having to use data binding. There is a nice feature. So first, data binding is based on the iNotify property change interface. So your objects have to implement this interface. And then you raise a property change event when an observable property changes. And this is a loose coupling between the source property and the target property. One nice feature of data binding in XAML and also in the MVVM Light binding framework is that if the source changes, the binding is going to reattach itself. And so during the course of the application, you don't have to monitor that. The binding framework is going to monitor that for you, okay? It is declarative programming. So in XAML, it's clear because you have your markup, you do your bindings in markup, it is declarative. It may sound a little bit strange in code that I talk about declarative programming, but if you think about it, it is the same workflow. You're going to define your view model, and then use data binding to connect the dots. And this is in a clearly defined places in your view. So I still consider that it is the same workflow. And I like this workflow because it really enables me to think of my view with my integrator role, my integrator hat, like I say, and to think of my view model with my developer hat. And so this is a clearly defined workflow, if you like. Most importantly, the nice thing with data bindings, is that you don't need to worry about refreshing the UI. You're going to act at the view model level. And then the properties are going to raise a property change event, and the bindings are going to actualize the UI. So you don't need to think about doing that in code. So it is a nice thing that you don't have to worry about. Okay? And then you can concentrate on adding features to your app or improving the user experience. Why not? For commanding is also a very important part of MVVM. It is based on the iCommand interface. And there is an implementation of that in MVVM Light, so you don't have to write your own if you don't want to. The nice thing with this interface is that it will actualize the control. So the command defines that it can be executed. It has an execute method. But it's also going to say if it can be executed or not, based on the context. And if the context changes, it can notify the UI and say, I cannot be executed anymore. And so the commanding framework is going to disable the control which is attached to the command. That's a nice feature because, again, it's one less thing that you need to worry about. Okay? And this works across the board. It is a loose coupling between the control and the command. And so you can expose your commands on your view models. You can do your view. If you want to swap, for example, a button for a checkbox, you can do that without touching the view model. So it's a nice workflow, again. Now, there are some disadvantages to bindings. And one problem is performance. For many cases, it just works, so you don't have to worry too much about it. But as usual with performance, there are some places where you probably don't want to use data binding, and you want to fall back to the classic approach instead, which is basically event handling and the classic Android iOS approaches for lists, etc. So think about it, right? Test your UI, test your views in stress conditions, make sure that it works. Data binding is slower. It is based on some reflection, so there is some reflection going on. And also another thing which I notice sometimes is that it can be a little bit confusing because you don't really know where to put the breakpoint when you debug, right? Because it's a loose coupling. And so like every loose system, loosely coupled system, understanding where it starts and where it ends may be a little bit more difficult, especially for junior programmers or people who don't have really that experience. That is not a huge problem because after a while you get it. In terms of support, you have data binding and commanding support on Windows XAML out of the box, so it is natively supported there, no questions asked. It is pretty much where it all started. And on Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android, you need to add an external package. For example, MVVM Light version 5. On Xamarin.Forms, the great news is that binding and commanding is supported out of the box. We'll see an example in a moment. So that's cool because the good people in the Xamarin.Forms team did the hard work for you. They integrated binding and commanding there. And so you can use the classic MVVM approaches there without having to change anything. Actually, when they asked me to do a talk and to include Xamarin.Forms, I was a little bit annoyed because I told them that's going to be super boring because basically it just works. OK, talk over, go back home, right? But that's really a nice feature. Interestingly, data binding is trending in HTML as well. You see, for example, AngularJS is using data binding. So the MVVM patterns, which was developed very much for XAML, came to HTML as well. And it's kind of interesting to see that trend going on. So let's do some code. I'm going to show you. Have some weird thing happening here, OK? I'm going to show you an application, and I am going to explain to you what's going on there. So the application is here going to connect to a web service which is exposing some JSON, and it is going to get a list. It's a list of flowers. Why not? I like flowers. I have many in my garden. And it is going to show some information about those flowers, and you are also going to be able to save some information, in this case, some comments back to the web service. So in terms of architecture, we have here 4 projects. We have a data assembly, which is a portable class library, which is going to be shared across the board. And then you have the Droid, the iOS, and the Windows Phone application. Here, let's start in the model. So first, I'm going to show you the abstraction of the service. Oops, can I move this out of the way? Here we go. So this abstraction, do you see behind, is it big enough? Yes? No? Yes? OK, cool. So there is a refresh method. This is all asynchronous. That's why it returns a task. It's going to return the list of flowers. There is a save method, also asynchronous. Normally, you want to abstract your data services, mostly because it is going to allow you to have multiple implementations of the service in your application. Okay, so here I have 2 implementations. I have one which is going to be my actual production application, service here. I have the URL. I have the refresh method, which is using an HTTP client. It is going to create a URL with a few parameters, to avoid that crazy people do crazy things to this service. Then there is the action of getting the JSON. It is asynchronous. That's why we have the await keyword. And then I'm going to deserialize the result using JSON.NET. And then I return the data property, which is the actual list of flowers. If I want to save, same thing. I'm going to use the HTTP client, build the URL. I'm going to serialize the flower objects that I want to save to JSON. And then I'm going to post that to my web service. It is also asynchronous. And then I'm going to check that the status code was OK. Very simple service. I have another implementation of this service, which is a design time implementation that I'm using especially on the Windows side, in Blend. Okay? With a few tweaks, you could also use that in your Xamarin Android, Xamarin iOS applications at runtime, but just to avoid connecting to the actual web service. And then you can enter whatever name you want for a flower. Make sure, I don't know what this guy wants. Go away, Bing. OK. You're kidding me, right? That's crazy. OK. So you can, for example, check what happens if a description for a flower is super long. OK, you know what? I'm going to put it down there. All right. So you're drunk, Bing. Go home. OK. So here I'm creating a number of flower objects, and those are going to be used at design time. Long story short, let's move on. The flower object here, this is an observable object, so it is an implementation of iNotify property changed. It is included in MVVM Light. I have a set method, and this set method is going to raise the property change event if needed, and it's going to return true or false depending on if the event was changed or not. Another interesting thing, I have here an observable collection for the command. So like I mentioned, observable collection is kind of a very important collection object in MVVM because it is going to raise the collection change event. And so your lists should actualize themselves automatically when this happens. It happens on XAML, happens on Xamarin.Forms. With a little bit of help from MVVM Light, it happens in iOS and Android as well. All right. So now let's check the view model layer, which is this new layer that we have here. So first, I'm going to start in the view model locator. This is an object that I like to have in MVVM Light implementation, in the MVVM Light architecture if you want. This is the object which is going to manage the lifetime of certain view models, the important view models in your application. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to start by doing a little bit of setup. I'm going to check if I'm in design mode on the Windows side. And here, for example, I could use, for an iFlower service, I could use a design flower service that I just showed you. Or in production, I want to use the actual flower service. So you can manage here which service you're going to use. So it's a nice feature of this IOC container. Here I'm using the simple IOC of MVVM Light that I mentioned earlier. Of course, you can use your own if you prefer. I'm going to register the main view model as well. And so here I expose a property called main, which is going to actually get this main view model instance from the IOC container. The nice thing when you do that is that it's going to create all the dependencies which are needed. For example, if I check here the main view model constructor, I see that I'm going to need two services, the iFlower service that we just showed, and also the iNavigation service. Just like I mentioned before, there is one implementation of navigation service per platform, because this is view code, okay? But the view model doesn't know that. It's just acting against iNavigation service to perform the navigation. Notice also the observable collection of flower view model. So this is what is going to govern our lists, okay? Let's take a look at the show details command. So this is a command, which means that it can be executed, for example, when the button is pressed or when something happens in the UI. It is taking here a flower as parameter, and it's going to navigate using the navigation service that I mentioned before to a details page key. And then it's going to give the flower object to the page. So this is a navigation with parameter. Why do I navigate to a key instead of a page? Well, again, it's because navigation in Windows Phone is not the same as in other platforms, iOS, and it's also not the same as in Android or in Xamarin.Forms. So you have to have an abstraction. So here I define some keys, and those keys are defined inside the view model locator here. In this particular case, I have two pages that my view models know. Okay? I'm going to show you how the implementation is working in a moment. So inside the main view model, I can add a little bit of code. And I'm going to add one property to start with, which is the last loaded property. This is a property which holds the date and time of when the list was refreshed in the last place. So to do that, I'm going to use code snippets. And when you install MVVM Light using the Visual Studio extension, you're going to get a collection of code snippets. You see that there is a whole list of them. In that case, I'm going to use MVVM INPC set lambda. So this is an INPC, an iNotify property change. So it's an observable property, which uses a set method and a lambda expression for the property. There is a whole lot of them. All of them are documented, and so you can find some information about those things. If I type on tab, it's going to expand the snippet. And now I can do some replace. So let's call that last loaded. Let's make that a date time. And then the name of the field. And I'm not going to initialize it. It's going to stay here. Oops. Last loaded. Sorry about that. I need to press escape. OK. Good. Now I'm going to add a feature. I'm going to add here a field which is going to be set to true when the view model is actually loading, so when there is an asynchronous operation going on. And then I'm going to use that to return another value called last loaded formatted. Okay? So this is what I'm going to display in my view. If I am loading, I'm going to show the text loading. I would probably expose another Boolean property of some kind and show an animation, whatever. Then, if I'm not loading, I'm going to show last loaded, and then either never or the date and time to which it was loaded last. Simple enough, but of course there is a relationship between last loaded formatted and the last loaded property. So I can easily establish a relationship here by saying that if the set property is successful, which means that the event has actually been raised, then I'm going to type raise property change last loaded formatted. You see you have a nice IntelliSense support, so it's quite convenient to type this. Now at this point, I want to add a command. And the command is going to be a relay command. This is the MVVM Light implementation of I command. And again, I have a snippet, so I can type MVVM R for relay, and then call that the refresh command. Here we go. The implementation is going to go as follows. I will have here, I will clear the observable collection. Then I will set isLoading to true because I am starting an asynchronous operation. And I'm going to raise the property change event for last loaded formatted to tell my UI you need to update yourself. Those things can be unit tested, by the way. Then I'm going to get the list by calling refresh. This is an asynchronous operation. I have await, so I need to make that asynchronous. Then I'm going to load the flowers in the list. Again, it's an observable collection, so I want the UI to refresh itself automatically. And then I'm going to say I'm done loading and save the date of last loaded. Then, in case there is an error, I'm going to show a dialog message to the user using iDialog service, which is a part of MVVM Light version 5. And again, you get an implementation for each platform. Or you can write your own if you prefer. So now that I have this, let's see how we consume that. Oh, before I do that, I want to show you another command which is interesting. Here, there is a save comment command. You see, this is a relay command of string. So it needs a parameter of type string. And the parameter is going to be the text of the command. Okay, so I'm going to use that to do my saving operation. But one thing which is interesting is that I'm going to test the value of the text and see if it is null or empty. I'm going to return false on this delegate here. This is a can execute delegate. And so the command is telling the UI, if the text is empty, I cannot be executed. And so I want the UI to automatically disable the button. Okay, so that's a feature of the command. Again, that can be easily unit tested. Good, so let's consume this inside our applications. We are going to start in the Windows Phone app. So in MVVM Light, we typically start in app.xaml. And I'm going to add here the view model locator as an instance of the resources of the application. So this is a global object. It's used everywhere in the application. I'm going to do a little bit of initialization in app.xaml. And specifically, I'm going to initialize the navigation service. Why do I do that here in the application? Because it is a Windows Phone specific implementation of navigation service. So in Windows Phone, we navigate using URLs. So when I want to go to the details page key, I'm going to go to detailspage.xaml. Okay? Same thing for add comment page.xaml. Then I register my objects with the IOC container. The view model, when he consumes those objects, doesn't know where it comes from. He doesn't have to care. On the main page, I'm going to set the data context for my page using the main property of the locator resource. So this is the main view model that we saw earlier. And so from this moment on, I can use data binding. For example, here, I'm going to set the item source of the list box using the flowers observable collection. XAML has this feature built in that the UI is going to refresh itself when the observable collection changes. I don't need to do that myself. Then I also have a data template. And this data template is also going to use binding against the flower object, because in the data template, the data context is the current flower object, which is displayed for this particular cell. Okay? So I can do that for the image URI, I can do that for the name, I can do that for the descriptions, etc. Now I'm going to just add two controls here. So let's go and add here a button, which is a refresh button. I'm going to bind that to the refresh command that I implemented earlier. I'm going to also expose here or add a text block, which is bound to the last loaded formatted properties that we had before. And now my UI is finished. Let's see in Android how it works. So in Android, I'm going to start also at a global level. And in Android, interestingly, there is no app class or application class or anything in Xamarin Android. So I just added one. And I expose my view model locator here. And here, I'm also going to do some initialization. Notably, I initialize the navigation service. And in Android, we navigate with types. So here's a type of detail activity. Okay? I also register my two services here. And then I'm going to go inside the main activity. Now, I like to split my activities in two partial classes. I like to have the horrible UI code on one end and the beautiful binding code on the other end. As you can see, I'm not biased at all. And so this is a horrible code that you have to write. I still don't know why, because that should be generated. Xamarin people, that should be generated. Okay? So you have here a list view, you have here a button. Inside my XML, I'm not going to show you that, but believe me, there is another, actually I'm going to show you that. There is another label that I want to expose here. So let's take the main.axml, and I'm just going to take the source. Here, this is a text view that I want to also expose in my main activity. So it's called last loaded text. So here, using another MVVM snippet, what I can do is MVVM droid element tab, and then say text view, text view, last loaded text, this is a field here, and then name that. Like this, at least you don't have to type it too much. You have a little bit of automatism here. Now, if I go in the other partial class of the main activity, which is where really the features are developed, I would say, I'm going to do some bindings in onCreate. And so I'm going to use the new MVVM Light extension methods. For example, on refresh button here, I'm going to use a set command method. This is an extension method that you get when you add MVVM Light to your apps. And I'm going to say for which event I want this command to fire, to be executed. That's for the click event. And which method is going to be executed, in that case, vm.refresh command. What is VM? VM is app.locator.main. So basically, this is, I'm using the view model locator as my point of entry to get the view model. Okay? So that is going to disable the button if needed. So it is going to actually follow the recommendation, well, not the recommendation, but the implementation that if can execute return false, the button should be disabled. Going to add another binding here, and this binding is this time using another extension method called setBinding. I'm going to set binding on the activity itself between vm.lastLoadedFormatted, the property that we implemented earlier, and the text property of the last loaded text view. Okay? Like this, every time that last loaded changes, the text view is going to be refreshed automatically. Now there is a question of the list. So I have a list view, and I don't want to write an adapter because this is really annoying code. So I'm going to use a third extension method called getAdapter. That's going to return you something that I call an observable adapter. And the observable adapter can be assigned to the adapter property of the list view. And like this, the list view is going to be refreshed automatically when the observable collection changes. You need to define how the cells are attached. That's the classic way of Android programming. So here I'm going to define a delegate for that. You get the flower view model, so the current item which is in the view there. And then I'm going to set the title, set the description, set here the image. And here notice that I'm not using binding because first of all, it doesn't need to. And second of all, I prefer to use the classic way simply because it's more performant. So we go back to what we had discussed earlier. OK. So now we have here the code for Android. Let's take a look in iOS. And in iOS, it's going to work in a very, very similar manner. So here I have an application object. It's inside main.cs. For some reason, not application.cs. Xamarin people, this is, again, the guideline of C#. We expose the view model locator. And then I'm going to configure my navigation service. This time, I navigate to the type of controller. I'm going to register my IOC containers. Everything is working the same. I also split my app delegate in two partial classes for the same reason as before. Here, this is where I do the ugly UI code. And here, this is where I do the more interesting code. I'm also going to get the view model through application.locator.main. I'm also going to add a command here on the refresh button. I'm using the clicked event because this is actually a navigation bar button. So I don't know, Apple has this weird idea that buttons are either clicked or touch up inside. Don't know why they don't just call it click, but whatever. Refresh command is passed. And here I'm going to set a binding between last loaded formatted and this UI label text property. Same thing for the list controller. Here I'm going to put it before initialize component because I'm doing a little bit of UI work on this controller in initialize component. But here I have the get controller extension method for iOS, which is going to return to you an observable controller. Same feature as in Android, it's going to refresh itself. You need two delegates in iOS. This is how iOS does things. So you need one to create the flower, the cell, sorry. So here I'm using the subtitle style. This is an image, title, subtitle. And then 1, 2, here, bind them all, like the ring, I guess. You have here the name, the description, and the image. OK, so I'm going to show you how this all works. Let me start that here. So here I'm using a physical device. Let's hope that internet is playing, you know, the gods of internet are with me here. I have here a label saying last loaded never. Going to refresh the button through the command. Now it says loading. Now I have the flowers loaded. The images are loaded asynchronously. I can click on add ORCID. I have here some commands and the description. I can add a command. Notice that the button is disabled because this field is empty. If I start typing, oops, oh yeah, I need to type here. Here we go. Then now the button is enabled. I can save the command, and now it's going to appear here. Let's see how it looks on the Android side. Going to start the app. Here we have also never. I'm going to refresh. Here are the list of flowers. The images are loaded asynchronously as well. I have my command. This is the last command that I just entered. The date time on this device is wrong. Sorry about that. Going to add the command and say hello Android. Save. Notice that the button is enabling and disabling itself dynamically based on what the view model is saying. And what about here in iOS? iOS, it's working exactly the same. I did a video because I didn't want to log my Mac just for a 2-minute demo. I refresh. You notice that the last loaded is correct. Here is a page. Here I split the commands page in two. So this is one of the nice features of Xamarin. You can customize the UI as you want. I'm going to add a comment. Notice that the save button is also disabled, and when I start typing, it's going to enable itself without me having to write code for that. It's just through the commanding framework. So what about forms? So the nice thing in forms, like I said, is that data binding is supported out of the box, and so you don't have to worry about that. So here, let's take a look at the architecture of my app. I have the exact same data portable class library. This is the same as I had before. It's actually a reference to the same project, okay? So all the changes we just made are inside. I have Android, iOS, and Windows Phone application, but in addition, I have an additional portable class library, which is where you will do the UI work once only, and then it will be shared, okay? Obviously, I use XAML. I'm a XAML lover, sue me. I have here my app.cs, which is a main entry point for the application. Same as before, I'm going to expose my view model locator there. I'm going to initialize the navigation service dialog service. Unfortunately, I have to say that because of a problem with NuGet and Xamarin.Forms, I cannot put those classes for Xamarin.Forms inside the MVVM Light assemblies at this time. NuGet is not able to detect if it's a Xamarin.Forms application or if it's a classic Xamarin Android /iOS /Windows Phone app. I'm going to work with the guys on that. But for the moment, you'll get here those files as separate files until I figure out a solution. So then the IOC container is initialized here and here. And then I'm going to consume that. So here, let's go into main page.xaml.cs. I can set the binding context. Please ignore the red. It's because Visual Studio doesn't understand. I don't know why. They have a problem here. But anyway, it's going to build just fine. So you have the binding context, which is the equivalent of data context in XAML, set to, in Windows XAML, set to app.locator.main. Okay? And so from this moment onwards, I can use data binding in my XAML. For example, here, setting the item source to the flowers observable collection. And thanks to the good people of the Xamarin.Forms team, you don't have to worry about refreshing your UI because the binding framework is going to do that, the one which is natively included in Xamarin.Forms. Okay? And also, you have an item template. And inside this item template, you can also do some binding against the flower, the current flower item, here for the image, here for the name, here for the description. And so if you run this application, let's see how it looks like on Windows Phone. You'll notice that the UI looks a little bit different because I have one UI for all platforms, so I had to do a little bit of UI compromises here and there, okay? But the same feature, I also have the last loaded down there. If I refresh, the list of flowers is getting fetched asynchronously. I have my list. I can navigate to this flower here. Here, I also split the page in two, so I have a comment page. Notice the comment that we just entered earlier. Add comment, same thing as before. The button is disabled, and it works fine. On Android, same thing. Same UI, because this time I really have one UI for all the platforms, OK? Can click on refresh, loading. Here is your kid, see comments, add comment. Button is disabled. Hello, forms. It's enabling itself, and now I'm saving. OK? I'm not showing you in iOS, but basically it's exactly the same. I'm going to publish. I have also a small video of the iOS solution there. So, in conclusion, first of all, I want to mention the open source commitment of MVVM Light. So it is running, or it is published, I should say, under the MIT license, which is probably the most permissive open source license that there is. I actually considered for a while using the what the fuck public license, which states that you can do what the fuck you want as long as you don't bother me if it doesn't work. And then I changed my mind. There is a WTFPL. You can check it out. It actually does exist. I decided to use MIT instead because MIT sounds kind of better when you speak to, a few hundred people like here. We are part of the .NET Open Source Foundation, which is a new venture, under the stewardship, that's the name, the stewardship of Microsoft. MVVM Light was one of the first projects to be invited inside this foundation. Hosting is on Codeplex. I take feedback and contribution, although I have to say I'm very conservative. I'm a Swiss guy. I like to take things with care and be a little bit slow, but basically I think this is one of the reasons why MVVM Light is so popular. It's because it is growing slowly, and I keep things simple. In terms of conclusion, I think that I showed you that MVVM makes sense on Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android as well as on XAML and Xamarin.Forms. It increases the code, the surface of code that you can share and test, so it does help. It abstracts the differences, so it helps you to build your code with clearly defined roles. It also increases the designability, especially on the Windows side, but also with a few tweaks on Xamarin, on the Xamarin side. And as for MVVM Light, it's going to help you speed up repetitive work and annoying work. It is a modular toolkit, so you can use what you like and leave what you don't like, replace some components with your own, no problem. You have access to a huge community of users. Just take a look at what's going on Stack Overflow, and you'll see that there is really quite a lot of traffic going on. Nice recognition by Microsoft and Xamarin. The mere fact that they flew me here to talk to you guys, I think, shows that. Really appreciate that. And here are a few resources. There is I mentioned it again, the course on Perl site, which is almost 5 hours of content and tips and tricks. So at this point, I have to thank you for your attention. I'm at 45 minutes pretty exactly, but since this is the last session of the day, I'm still going to take questions. But for those of you who want to go to the party, please find me and come and talk to me there. I'm also here on Thursday and Friday, so I'm happy to take questions at this occasion as well. So I wish you a good end of the conference, happy coding, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Any questions? Absolutely, that's a good question. There is my blog here on top. Expect the source code to be published either tomorrow, if I don't drink too much beer tonight, or the day after, I mean, very soon, OK? And there is also on my blog, I'm just going to publish in a few minutes a blog post which explains the new release, the version 5 release, where you can get the source code, what you need to install, these kind of things, OK? All right.
So I have a question here.
Yep, hey.
Well, first of all, congrats on getting MVVM Light upgraded, and always happy to see it because I'm a big fan. With your experience so far with Xamarin.Forms, would you recommend it as a good place to start for pretty much any app? And what do you think is the #1 feature they should be working on? So
that's a complex question. Would I recommend it? Yes, for a certain class of applications, not for all apps. I think that it's a great place to start if you do, especially applications where the UI, I mean, we work on classes of applications which go to consumers where the UI has to be pixel perfect and the experience has to be customized for each device. And so I wouldn't necessarily start in Xamarin.Forms for that kind of applications. However, there are other applications where it totally makes sense. And if I had to choose between a hybrid app with Cordova, HTML, whatever, or that, I would definitely go that route because this is better, okay? This is a true native experience that you get in the end. Also, there is the thing that when you start here, you can also port your application gradually to actual native UI, either by building the custom renderers or by just swapping pages with your own pages, right? And then you also have to do the UI works 3 times, but that's what we do, right? So yes, I would recommend it for certain applications. It's still, honestly, it's still quite early for that framework, right? So I'm expecting some improvements, but it's already quite usable. I definitely encourage at least checking it out, at least. Yeah. And what was the other question?
Well, what do you think they should be, working on as their highest priority?
Yeah. Another question? No, just kidding. I mean, a designer. Yeah. But it's hard. I mean, I don't blame them, right? It's super hard. You need 3 designers, or at least kind of a renderer where you see at least a static image of your page, these kind of things. They do amazing work in the iOS designer space, the Android designer space as well. So now I think, yeah, I think it would be cool to see them invest inside there. But that's hard, I mean, yeah.
I would be interested in hearing from you how you would compare or contrast MVVM Light with Prism.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I was expecting you would name MVVM Cross, actually. I was kind of prepared for that, and Stuart, and Stuart is a good friend of mine, so the guy who does MVVM Cross. Prism, yeah, so Prism is not an MVVM framework. It is an extensibility framework. And so the goal of Prism is different than the goal of MVVM Light, but there is some overlap, which is kind of interesting. At some point, I mean, there is some collaboration as well going on, right? I mean, these guys and me, we talk, and so that's cool. Prism is what I would recommend if you have an application which needs to be extensible at the UI level. So if you have plugins, if you have this kind of region manager, especially the region manager is pretty cool. Though I have to say I built applications before, Daniel is here and smiling. I have built some applications before with MVVM Light and MEF. You maybe know that Prism is built on MEF, so MEF is the Managed Extensibility Framework of Microsoft. And the custom region manager, it was cool as well, so it kind of depends. I think that Prism, the learning curve in Prism is steeper, and so I recommend using it for bigger apps, typically. We use Prism typically on WPF apps, rather big apps, I would say. But a lot of concepts are similar. They also have a messenger, or they call it event aggregators. They also have relay commands. They also or delegate command, it's called there. They also have a few things. So there is definitely some overlap. Okay? All right. Any other questions? I'm sorry? Yeah, cool. Yeah, no, sure. So MVVM Cross is an awesome framework. It's been in Xamarin for a long time. Which is definitely a good thing. I think that quite a lot of people use it. In my opinion, it is more complex to use than MVVM Light. And I don't know if you know that on the Windows side, we have a similar situation where there is another framework called Caliburn, which is super popular to build, rather large applications. But the learning curve is steeper. And so I think that for certain class of apps, especially mobile apps, I would rather recommend checking MVVM Light to get started with, get acquainted with the MVVM pattern and all that. You will have less things to learn than with MVVM Cross. But you will have less features. And so it's kind of a trade-off. What do you want, right? Choosing is not super easy, but I think that, send me a message at some point. I'm happy to advise you if I can. Stuart, I'm sure as well for MVVM Cross. Those two frameworks, I would say, are kind of the equivalent of Caliburn / MVVM Light on the Windows side. There is, MVVM Light / MVVM Cross on the Android iOS side, on the Xamarin side. Definitely some really good stuff in Stuart's framework as well. Have I been diplomatic enough? Yeah, cool. Yes?
Sorry. I guess it's the same kind of question, but why would you suggest using MVVM Light over using the MVVM implementation that's in Forms?
Well, that's mostly about sharing code, really. So the Forms implementation, my opinion about that, and by the way, there is also some MVVM implementations in Windows. When you start, you do certain Windows Phone applications, for example, have some MVVM classes which get added automatically. It's always the same thing, right? Basically, it's to make people sensitive that there is a pattern called MVVM and that there are some classes like a relay command, like these kind of things. So in the end, after that, it depends what frameworks you're targeting, how many frameworks, is it enough for you or do you need more, right? So the advantage of MVVM Light over those super simple implementations, if I may call them that, is that the community of MVVM Light is definitely larger. The components, I created MVVM Light in 2009, so some of the components go back to those days, so they are really tested and quite reliable, I would say. And also you have the portability, which means that you use the same components, the same view model code on each platform, so there is that advantage. But definitely some good stuff. I mean, I keep checking those classes because you know that most of what we do is stealing other people's code, right? And kind of reformatting it. That's true for me as well. And so sometimes I see some really good ideas, and sometimes I might just enjoy them as well. That's what we do with open source code, right? We always learn from other people's work. Any other question? Oh, there is somebody there behind. I think that will be the last question, and then we'll go and see fishies and drink beer.
It's related to the Prism question that he asked before. I was just wondering if there's a need in the mobile application that you can do this composite UI type of approach where you define the reusable view, then you can inject them into a region. Is that a popular pattern in
on mobile apps?
Mobile space?
Yeah, less than. I mean, typically the UI tends to be simpler on mobile applications than on desktop apps. And typically what you do is that if you have some component that you really think you need to inject, my recommendation would rather be to make a separate page for that with some clearly defined navigation between both. But I mean, it is possible, right? On the Windows side, we have those universal applications where you can share XAML as well. So here I have a little bit more experience, and you can actually create user controls, so pieces of the view, right? In Android, they call them fragments, but it's pretty much the same thing. And then reuse them in different places and inject them, like you were saying. So yeah, it's possible, but don't forget that it's a small real estate. I would keep it simple. Okay? I cannot hear you. Well, come to see me and we'll talk, okay? Everybody else, thank you very much for staying, and I will see you at the party and tomorrow and Friday. Thanks.